My family betrayed me 2 weeks before my wedding to vacation with my perfect brother, but I got married without them. And when they saw the photos on social media, they showed up furious, demanding answers. They never expected I'd block them forever. I'm 32 years old. I work in digital marketing, and 3 months ago, I got married without my parents being there. Which sounds crazy when you put it like that, but the truth is they chose not to be there. And that decision basically ended whatever relationship might have remained between us. I guess I should start from the beginning so you understand how we got to this point. Because it's not like I just woke up one day and decided, to exclude my parents from one of the most important days of my life. I was always the problem child, or at least, that's how they saw me. My brother, Christopher, is 40 now. He's 8 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he was the perfect son. Like the one who got the best grades, who never got in trouble, who did everything right according to my parents' William and Patricia's standards. I, on the other hand, was the one who came home late, who preferred spending time with my friends over studying for exams, who chose to study graphic design instead of something more serious like business or engineering. It's not like I was a delinquent or anything like that, but compared to Christopher, I was basically a disaster in my parents' eyes. You know what I mean? Christopher became this super successful businessman. He has his own consulting company or something like that. He married a woman my parents adore. They had 2 perfect kids who go to private schools. They live in a huge house in the suburbs. The whole American dream thing. And my parents never missed an opportunity to remind me how well he was doing. Like every time I visited them, it was, "Oh, Christopher just bought a new car. Oh, Christopher and his family are going on vacation to Europe. Oh, you should see how well they're doing." It was exhausting, honestly, but I was already used to it after so many years. I met Emily about 6.5 years ago. It was at this kind of boring work conference where we were both trying to sneak out early, and we connected immediately. She's an industrial designer, works creating products for a tech company, and she's basically the most patient and understanding person I've ever met, which turned out to be super important considering what came later. My parents met her after we'd been dating for about 6 months, and their reaction was lukewarm, let's say. Like they didn't hate her, but they weren't excited either. I remember my mother commented something about Emily seeming nice, with that tone you use when you really don't have anything good to say, but you're trying to be polite. Anyway, Emily and I got engaged about 10 months ago. It was pretty simple. No super expensive ring or elaborate proposal. Just the 2 of us in our apartment after a night of watching movies. And I just asked her if she wanted to marry me, and she said yes. We told our families the next day, and my parents' reaction was basically, "Oh, that's nice. Congratulations." Like we'd told them we'd bought a new plant or something. Emily's family, on the other hand, was super excited. Her mother cried and everything. It was nice to see that stark difference. We decided we wanted a small wedding, nothing elaborate, like maximum 40 people between family and close friends. Because neither of us are really big event people, and besides, we didn't have the budget for something massive. We chose a date that seemed reasonable to us, about 8 months after the engagement, which gave us enough time to plan everything without rushing. We let everyone know well in advance, like 8 months ahead. We sent out save the dates and everything, because we wanted to make sure people could make plans, request time off work, all those things you need time to organize. My parents said they'd be there, that of course they wouldn't miss it, and I honestly wasn't expecting much enthusiasm, but at least I thought they'd fulfill the basic requirement of showing up. Christopher also said he'd try to come, but it depended on his work schedule, which was typical of him, always making everything sound like he was the busiest man on the planet. His wife and kids would probably come anyway, he said, even if he couldn't, which seemed fine to me. I honestly didn't care much whether he came or not. Fast forward about 6 months, we'd already booked the ceremony venue, hired the caterer, Emily had found her dress, I'd rented my suit, basically everything was in order. It was then, 2 weeks before the wedding, that my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working. She told me, in that casual tone she uses when she's about to say something she knows will upset me, that she and my father had been talking to Christopher and that he'd gotten this incredible opportunity to travel to Australia for 2 weeks with his whole family, something work-related but also kind of like a vacation, and that my parents had decided to go with them. I sat there at my desk trying to process what I'd just heard, like my brain literally couldn't connect the words my mother was saying. I asked her, "Are you serious?" And she said yes, that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, that Christopher was paying for the whole trip for them, that they hadn't had a family vacation altogether in years. I reminded her, "Mom, my wedding is in 2 weeks," and she made this sound like, "Oh, right," as if she'd genuinely forgotten or something, which was impossible because we'd been talking about the wedding constantly for the last few months. Then she told me, "Well, maybe you can postpone the wedding," like she said it as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if changing a wedding date 2 weeks out was equivalent to rescheduling a dentist appointment. I explained to her that no, we couldn't postpone anything, that we'd already paid for everything, that guests had already made their plans, that it was literally impossible. She got a bit defensive and said that, "Then I guess we'll miss it. I'm very sorry, but this opportunity won't come around again, and Christopher really wants us to go." I hung up the phone and sat there for I don't know how long, probably like 20 minutes, just staring at my computer screen without really seeing anything. Emily came home that night and found me basically in the same spot where she'd left me in the morning, and when I told her what had happened, she got angrier than I did, like she was furious, saying how was it possible that my parents would do something like that it was an insult, that she couldn't believe they'd choose a vacation over their son's wedding. I spent the next few days in this weird state of shock mixed with rage, but there was also this part of me that wasn't really surprised, you know? Like, deep down, I always knew something like this could happen, that when it really mattered, Christopher and his perfect family were going to be more important than me. Emily suggested I confront my parents, tell them everything I'd been holding in for years, but I didn't have the energy, honestly. I just wanted it all to be over. I called my mother about 3 days later and told her, in the most neutral voice I could manage, that I understood, that it was okay, that we'd postpone the wedding. I could hear the relief in her voice when she said, "Oh, that's good, James. I knew you'd understand. This means so much to your father and me, and to Christopher too." I didn't tell her I was lying, that we weren't going to postpone anything, that the wedding would go ahead exactly as planned, just that they wouldn't be there to see it. Emily and I got married on the original date with 38 people present. Her family, some of my aunts and uncles who came despite my parents not being there, and our closest friends. It was a beautiful ceremony, honestly, small and intimate, exactly what we wanted. There was a moment during the vows where I looked toward where my parents should have been and felt this weird hollow in my chest, but I also felt something else, like liberation maybe. Like I'd finally cut this rope that had been pulling me backward my whole life. We posted photos on social media that same night, like the typical wedding photos, Emily in her white dress, me in my gray suit, the cake, guests toasting, the whole thing. I didn't think much about it when I posted them. Honestly, I was just sharing one of the happiest days of my life with the people who mattered to me. It was around 2 in the morning. Emily and I were already at the hotel where we'd spend our first night as husband and wife, when the messages started coming in. My mother called me first, like consecutive calls one after another. 17 missed calls before I woke up and saw the phone. When I finally answered, she was hysterical, screaming something about the photos, about how we'd gotten married without them, about how could I have done this to them. My father was in the background yelling too. I could hear him saying, "Give me the phone. Give me the phone." I told her, "You chose not to come. You chose to go on vacation. I gave you the opportunity to be there, and you rejected it." She started with this thing about, "But you said you were going to postpone." And I responded, "Yes, I lied to you. Just like you've been lying to me my whole life about how much you care about me compared to Christopher." That shut her up for a second, and then she started crying, saying, "How could I say something like that they loved me the same as my brother, that this had nothing to do with favoritism?" I told her that if they really loved me the same, they would have been at my wedding, period. There's no excuse that's valid. My father grabbed the phone and basically yelled at me for like 5 minutes without letting me talk, saying I was a liar, that I'd manipulated them, that I'd planned all this to make them look bad. I asked him how exactly I'd manipulated them when they were the ones who decided to go on a trip, and he said that Christopher didn't know anything about the wedding date, that if he'd known, he would have scheduled the trip for another week. That made me laugh, honestly, like a real laugh but without humor, because it was so obviously false. I'd sent the save the date to everyone 8 months ago. But it was clear my father was looking for any excuse to blame me. I hung up the phone and put it on silent. Emily was awake next to me, asking what had happened, and when I told her, she just hugged me and said she was so sorry, that my parents didn't deserve to be in our lives if that's how they were going to act. We spent the rest of the night not really sleeping, me turning everything over in my head, feeling this mixture of guilt and anger and relief all at the same time. The messages kept coming for the next few days, my parents sending me long texts about how disappointed they were. My brother Christopher sending me one that basically said I'd been immature and selfish. Some relatives that apparently my parents had been calling to tell their version of the story where I was the villain. I blocked Christopher immediately. I had no interest in hearing his opinions about my life, and I stopped responding to my parents' messages too. About a week after the wedding, I got a message from my mother saying they'd returned from Australia and needed to talk to me urgently, that it was important. I was at work when the message arrived and honestly considered ignoring it, but Emily convinced me to at least hear what they had to say, that maybe they were going to really apologize and we could start fixing things. I don't know why I listened to her. I guess part of me still had hope that my parents could act like functional adults for once. They arrived at my apartment directly from the airport, literally still with their suitcases, which should have seemed weird to me, but at that moment I just thought they were desperate to fix things. My mother had red eyes like she'd been crying. During the whole flight, my father looked angry but also tired, like that combination of emotions that makes people look 10 years older suddenly. We sat in the living room. Emily made coffee, though no one really touched it, and my parents started with this prepared speech about how they were very sorry, but that I also had to understand their perspective, that it had been unfair of me to lie to them, that communication works both ways. I let them talk because I didn't have the energy to interrupt them, and when they finished, I just told them, "You chose a vacation with Christopher over my wedding. There's no perspective that changes that fact." My father stood up and started pacing back and forth, saying it was more complicated than that Christopher had been going through difficult times at work, that he needed time with family, that they just wanted to help keep the family together. I asked him, "And what about keeping me in the family? Doesn't that matter?" And he didn't respond, just kept walking and muttering things about how I didn't understand. My mother tried a different approach, saying, please don't cut contact with them, that I was their son and they loved me, that we could get through this if everyone made an effort. I told her the effort had to come from them, not me, that I'd spent 32 years trying to earn their approval and attention while watching them give everything to Christopher without him having to do anything. She started crying again. My father pointed his finger at me, saying I was being dramatic and exaggerated, and basically we ended up all yelling at each other for I don't know how long until Emily left the room because she couldn't take it anymore, and I asked them to leave. They left furious, my mother crying, my father giving me this look of, "You're ungrateful." And I stood there at the door watching them get into the taxi with their suitcases, feeling absolutely nothing, like I was so emotionally exhausted I couldn't even process what had just happened. Emily came out and hugged me, and I think that's when I finally realized I'd probably just had the last real conversation with my parents, at least for a long time. About 2 weeks of total silence passed, no messages, no calls, nothing. And I was starting to get used to the idea that this was how things were going to be from now on. Emily and I were planning our honeymoon. We decided to wait a bit after the wedding to travel because with all the drama, we didn't have the headspace for a vacation. But we were ready to go somewhere and forget about everything for a while. Then I got a message from my mother. It was different from the previous ones, like calmer and more measured, saying that she and my father had been talking a lot, that they'd talked to a therapist, which surprised me quite a bit, honestly, and that they wanted to invite me and Emily to dinner so we could talk things through, like civilized adults. It said they weren't going to fight, that they just wanted to hear my perspective and share theirs, that they wanted to try to fix the relationship because at the end of the day, I was their son, and that meant something to them. Emily was skeptical, obviously. She told me it was probably some kind of trap or manipulation, but I felt that maybe, just maybe, my parents had really reflected on everything and were willing to admit they'd been wrong. I know that sounds naive, especially after everything that had happened, but I guess part of me still wanted to believe they could change, that we could have some kind of normal relationship. We accepted the invitation, and my parents suggested this Italian restaurant they'd always liked, a kind of fancy place, but not too formal. They said they'd made a reservation for 7 o'clock on a Friday. Emily and I arrived like 5 minutes late because traffic was horrible. And when we entered the restaurant and I gave our name to the host, he led us to a table in the back. And there they were, Christopher, his wife, and his 2 kids, sitting at the table with my parents, all smiling like this was some kind of happy family reunion. I literally froze in the middle of the restaurant. Emily grabbed my arm and whispered, "What the fuck?" And I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or run out. My parents immediately stood up. My mother saying, "Oh, good, you made it. We want the whole family to be together for this," and my father pulling out a chair for me as if nothing was weird about the situation. I stood there without moving, looking at Christopher, who had this kind of smug expression on his face, like that little smile he always used when he knew he'd won something. I asked my parents, "This was a trap. You told me it would just be us." And my mother said, "No, it wasn't a trap. They just thought it would be good for all of us to be together, to work things out as a family." Christopher finally spoke, with that condescending voice he always used with me, saying, "Hey, little brother. Sit down. Don't be dramatic. We just want to talk." I told him I wasn't his little brother, that I was 32 years old, and didn't need him talking to me like I was 5. He laughed and said, "Well, clearly you do need it considering how you've been acting, like a kid throwing a tantrum because mommy and daddy didn't go to his party." I felt Emily squeeze my arm, probably to keep me from jumping over the table and punching Christopher in the face, which I was honestly considering doing. Instead, I asked him, "Did you know about my wedding? Did you know the date?" And he shrugged and said, "Yeah, I knew." So what? That made my parents a bit uncomfortable. My mother saying, "Wait, Christopher, you said you didn't know," and him laughing as if it were a funny misunderstanding instead of a huge lie. Christopher continued explaining, with that same smug smile, that of course he knew about the wedding. That in fact it was his idea to organize the Australia trip specifically on those dates because, and I, quote, "I wanted to show mom and dad that my family knows how to value time together, not like others who just organize weddings for attention." He said it just like that, literally, while cutting his steak as if we were talking about the weather. My father tried to intervene, saying no, that wasn't true, that Christopher hadn't known, and it had all been a misunderstanding. But Christopher interrupted him, saying, "Dad, enough. Let's stop pretending. James needs to hear the truth." The truth, according to Christopher, was that my parents had always had to deal with my problematic behavior, that I'd always been the difficult son who never appreciated anything they did for me, and that it was time for me to understand that actions have consequences. I asked him what actions exactly. What had I done to deserve my parents missing my wedding? And he started listing things from when we were like 15 and 23 years old. Things like the time I was late to a family dinner, or when I chose to go to a concert instead of his oldest son's college graduation. Everything he mentioned was basically normal, you know? Like things any person would do. But he presented them as if they were unforgivable crimes that proved I was selfish and didn't care about family. My parents were just sitting there saying nothing, my mother looking at her plate, my father with his arms crossed, and it was in that moment I understood this wasn't an accidental ambush, that they'd planned this with Christopher, probably thinking that if they sat us all together, they could convince me that I was the problem, that I needed to apologize and thank them for tolerating me all these years. I told Emily we're leaving, and she immediately stood up, ready to go. But my mother extended her hand saying, "Wait, James, please, we need to resolve this." I asked her what exactly they wanted me to resolve, if they wanted me to thank them for missing my wedding, if they wanted me to thank Christopher for deliberately organizing a trip to ensure my parents couldn't attend, because if that's what they expected, then clearly there was nothing to resolve. Christopher said something else. I don't remember exactly what, because honestly at that point my brain was like saturated with rage and disappointment, but I do remember he used the words immature and selfish like 5 times in one sentence. I told him, trying to keep my voice calm, even though it was shaking a bit, that if being mature to him meant accepting being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family, then I'd rather be immature forever. My father finally spoke, raising his voice saying enough, that this situation was ridiculous, and that I was ruining what could be a beautiful reconciliation, just because I couldn't accept that sometimes life doesn't revolve around me. That made me laugh, like a real laugh but without humor, because the irony of my father telling me life didn't revolve around me when he'd spent 40 years of his life. Making everything revolve around Christopher was too much. I told him he was right, that life didn't revolve around me, that had become very clear, but that I also wasn't going to keep waiting for crumbs of attention and affection while Christopher got all the cake. That sounded very metaphorical when I said it, but I think they got the point. Emily was already walking toward the exit. I followed her, and the last thing I heard was my mother saying, "James, please don't do this. Don't throw everything away." We left the restaurant and walked like 3 blocks without talking. Emily finally stopped and hugged me right there in the middle of the street, and I realized I was shaking, like my whole body vibrating with adrenaline or rage, or whatever you feel when you realize that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally actually have a bunch of conditions you're never going to be able to meet. When we got home that night, I blocked my parents on everything. Phone, social media, email, everything. Emily asked me if I was sure, and I told her yes, more sure than ever. That if in 32 years they hadn't been able to see me as someone worthwhile, then another 32 years weren't going to change anything. She just nodded and said she supported me in whatever I decided. That my family now was her, and that was enough. It's been about 3 months since that disastrous dinner. My parents tried to contact me through relatives, aunts and uncles sending me messages saying my parents wanted to talk, that they were devastated, that please, reconsider. I responded to all of them with the same thing, that I appreciated their concern, but my decision was final and I'd prefer if they respected that. Christopher apparently told the whole extended family that I cut contact because I'm immature and couldn't handle a difficult conversation. Which is funny considering he admitted to sabotaging my wedding intentionally. Some relatives stopped talking to me, choosing my parents and Christopher's side. Others sent me messages of support saying they'd always noticed the favoritism but never knew how to mention it. Emily and I finally went on our honeymoon last month, 2 weeks in Greece. It was amazing. Exactly what we needed. I didn't think about my parents or Christopher or any of that shit while we were there. I just enjoyed being with my wife and really starting our life together, without all that family weight dragging me down. We got back about 2 weeks ago, and since then it's been weird. Like not bad, but definitely different. There are moments where something happens, something good or funny or interesting, and my first instinct is to want to call my mom to tell her, and then I remember we don't do that anymore, that we're probably never going to do that again. And there's this second where I feel sad, but then I remember why I made this decision, and the sadness goes away. I don't know if I did the right thing, honestly. There are people who tell me that family is family and I should try to fix things, that I'm going to regret it when my parents are old or die and I don't have a chance to reconcile with them. But there's also all these other people, including Emily and her parents, who have basically adopted me, who tell me I did right in establishing boundaries, that no one deserves to be treated as a secondary option by their own parents. What I do know is that for the first time in a long time, I feel light, you know? Like, I'd taken off this super heavy backpack I'd been carrying for years, without realizing how much it weighed. My life is simpler now, smaller maybe without all that family, but it's also calmer, without that constant stress of trying to be enough for people who'd already decided I never would be. Emily is pregnant. We found out about a week ago, and when she told me, the first thing I felt was pure excitement, and the second was relief that our child isn't going to grow up in that environment of comparisons and favoritism. They're going to grow up knowing they're loved without conditions, without having to compete with anyone for attention, and that makes me feel like maybe this whole horrible situation has at least one silver lining. I haven't decided if I'm going to tell my parents about the pregnancy when the baby is born. Part of me feels they deserve to know, that it's their grandchild after all. But another bigger part thinks that if they couldn't show up to my wedding, then they haven't earned the right to know my child. Emily says we have time to decide, that we don't have to figure it out now. And she's right. But I know, eventually I'm going to have to make that decision. For now, I'm focused on building my own family with Emily, on being the kind of father my parents never were for me, and on moving forward without that constant weight of disappointment and resentment. I don't know if I'll ever forgive my parents for choosing Christopher and his perfect vacation over my wedding, but I also don't know if I need to forgive them to move on with my life. Maybe that's the answer in itself, right? that not everything needs resolution or forgiveness for you to be happy.